That night, Constantinople was still standing. The walls were unbroken, the gates were still open, the empire still existed. But everyone inside the city knew something the world outside did not. There would be no tomorrow. This was not the night Constantinople fell. This was the night before it became inevitable. For more than 1,000 years, the Byzantine Empire had survived everything history could throw at it: plagues, civil wars, religious schisms, crusades, sieges, betrayals. The city had been attacked dozens of times and survived them all. The walls had always held. Until now. On the evening of May 28, 1453, Constantinople was silent in a way it had never been before. Not peaceful, exhausted. The kind of silence that comes when there are no more options left to consider. Outside the walls, the Ottoman army waited. Tens of thousands of soldiers, cannons positioned and ready, fires flickering across the hills. The largest siege force the city had ever faced. Inside the walls, there was no confusion. There was clarity. The defenders knew the city could not hold another full assault. The walls were damaged. The men were exhausted. Supplies were nearly gone. Reinforcements were not coming. This was the final night. Emperor Constantine V understood it better than anyone. He had inherited an empire in name, not in power. The territory of Byzantium had shrunk to little more than the city itself. Once the center of the Roman world, it was now an isolated fortress surrounded by enemies and abandoned by allies. For weeks, Constantine had hoped for relief: Venetian ships, Genoese reinforcements, a miracle. None arrived. Western Europe watched, prayed, did nothing. The emperor walked the walls that night, speaking to soldiers, clergy, and civilians alike. He did not promise victory. He promised honor. He reminded them of what the city represented, of what it had endured, of what would be lost if it fell. This was not a speech meant to inspire hope. It was meant to prepare them for death. Inside the city, churches were full, not with celebration, but with confession. Catholics and Orthodox prayed together for the first time in centuries. The schism that had divided Christianity mattered less than survival. People did not argue theology that night. They asked for forgiveness. Merchants closed shops that would never reopen. Families gathered in homes they would soon abandon or lose. The streets were dimly lit. Voices were low. Everyone knew that by morning the city would belong to someone else. And still, the gates remained open. This is what made the night unbearable. The waiting. The defenders knew the attack would come at dawn. They had watched the Ottomans prepare. They had heard the cannons test fire. They had counted the numbers. There was no scenario where Byzantium survived, yet the city did not surrender. Why? Because Byzantium had learned something over 1,000 years of survival. Surrender did not save empires. It erased them. If the gates were opened willingly, the empire would end without resistance. Its legacy would be submission, not defiance. Constantine refused that ending. If Byzantium was to fall, it would fall fighting. That night, the emperor removed the symbols of imperial comfort. He wore armor instead of robes. He ate with soldiers instead of courtiers. He became one of them. There would be no evacuation, no negotiation, no escape. Constantine XV would die with his city. The city itself seemed to understand. The walls loomed over dark streets like ancient guardians. Scars from centuries of war were visible in stone. These walls had stopped Persians, Arabs, Russians, Crusaders. But walls do not fail because they are weak. They fail because the world changes. The Ottomans had something Byzantium had never faced before: modern artillery, cannons that shook the earth, projectiles that cracked stone that had resisted centuries of assault. The walls were no longer invincible. That night, the defenders knew that history had finally caught up with them. Byzantium was not being defeated by courage or numbers alone. It was being defeated by time. As midnight passed, final preparations were made, positions assigned, weapons inspected, prayers whispered. The bells did not ring. There would be no warning. The attack would begin at first light, and when it did, the city would not have the strength to stop it. That was the cruel certainty of the final night. Not fear, not panic, acceptance. The Byzantine Empire had survived by adapting. But there are moments when adaptation ends and legacy begins. This was one of them. By dawn, The gates would close, and with them, more than a city would fall. As the night deepened, Constantinople turned inward. There was no chaos, no shouting in the streets. Panic had already burned itself out during the weeks of siege. What remained was something colder and heavier: resignation. The defenders knew the walls would be breached. The only uncertainty was where. The great cannons outside the city had been firing day after day, slowly eating away at stone that had once seemed eternal. Every impact sent vibrations through the ground, reminding everyone inside that the city's defenses were no longer absolute. The walls were still standing, but they were no longer whole. Inside the Blackernai sector, the damage was worst. Repairs had been made with whatever materials were available: rubble, wood, earth. The defenders knew these were temporary solutions. They were buying hours, not safety. And hours were all they had left. Emperor Constantine V spent the night moving through the city. He did not isolate himself in the palace. He did not hide behind ceremony. He walked among soldiers who had already accepted that they would not survive the next day. He thanked them. He asked forgiveness. He reminded them that they were the last line between the city and oblivion. This was not. Leadership meant to command obedience. It was leadership meant to share fate. In the Hagia Sophia, the last imperial ceremony took place. Candles illuminated the vast interior. The air was thick with incense and grief. For the first time since the Great Schism, Orthodox and Catholic Christians prayed together under one roof. Politics had failed. Theology no longer mattered. This was not unity born of reconciliation. It was unity born of extinction. People prayed not for victory, but for mercy, for their families, for their souls. Many understood that the city would fall and that survival would be a matter of chance, not courage. Outside, the Ottoman camp was alive with preparation. Drums were silent, but movement was constant. Units were assigned. Orders were passed. The Janissaries waited apart, disciplined and calm. They knew they would be sent in last when the defenders were already broken. The Ottomans had learned patience. This was not a reckless assault. It was a calculated end. Inside the city, defenders took their final positions. Genoese mercenaries stood beside Byzantine soldiers. Old alliances meant little. What mattered was the wall in front of them and the dawn behind them. Every man understood the same truth. Once the attack began, there would be no relief. The gates were inspected one final time, not to open them, but to ensure they would hold as long as possible. The defenders did not expect the gates to be breached first. They expected the walls to fail. They were right. As the night passed into its final hours, sleep became impossible. Soldiers leaned against stone, conserving energy. Some wrote final messages. Others stared into darkness, listening to distant sounds from the Ottoman camp. The city felt ancient that night, older than its people, older than its empire, as if the stones themselves remembered every siege they had survived and understood that this one was different. Constantinople had been the center of the world once, Rome's heir, Christianity's stronghold, a city that had shaped empires and civilizations. Now it was alone. No fleet appeared on the horizon, no banners rose in the distance, no miracle came. Shortly before dawn, Emperor Constantine addressed his commanders one last time. He did not issue complex plans. There were no maneuvers left to attempt. He spoke of duty, of honor, of legacy. He reminded them that Byzantium had lived far longer than anyone had expected, that its survival itself had been a defiance of history. Now, history was catching up. He ended with a simple truth. The city would fall, but it would not surrender. The final preparations were made, armor adjusted, weapons gripped tightly, positions locked in. There would be no retreat once the assault began. The empire had reached the edge of time. Outside the walls, the first signals were being prepared. Torches moved, orders were whispered, the Ottomans were ready. Inside the city, silence returned. A tense, unbearable quiet. The kind that exists only when everyone knows exactly what is coming. This was the last moment Constantinople would ever experience as the capital of an empire. The gates were still closed, the walls were still standing, the empire still existed, but only for a few more hours. Dawn did not arrive gently. It came with noise, fire, and motion. As the first light touched the eastern sky, the Ottoman cannons spoke again, this time without pause. Stone shattered, dust rose. The sound echoed through the city like a warning that history was no longer waiting. The final assault had begun. The first waves were sent forward not to win, but to exhaust. Irregular troops surged toward the breaches, testing defenses, forcing the defenders to reveal their positions, draining their strength. The Byzantines fought them back again and again, but every repelled attack cost lives they could not replace. This was the Ottomans' advantage. They could spend men. The city could not. Hour by hour, the defenders weakened. Ammunition ran low. Arms grew heavy. Wounds went untreated. The walls, already scarred, continued to crumble under constant fire. At the Blachernay sector, the breach widened. Makeshift repairs collapsed. Rubble turned into ramps. What had once been an obstacle became an entry point. Inside the city, messengers ran through narrow streets carrying news no one wanted to hear. The walls were failing. The line was thinning. The enemy was getting closer. Still, the gates remained closed. Emperor Constantine took his final position near the breach. He wore no imperial insignia, no crown, no purple. He fought as a soldier, not as a ruler. In that moment, there was no empire left to govern, only a city to defend. When the Janissaries were finally sent in, the tone of the battle changed, disciplined, relentless, unstoppable. They advanced with coordination the exhausted defenders could not match. The city's fate was sealed. Some point, the fighting ceased to be organized defense and became survival. Units dissolved, command structure collapsed. Small groups fought where they stood, unaware of what was happening elsewhere. The walls were breached, and then a gate was opened. Not through negotiation, not through surrender, but through chaos. The Kirkaporta Gate, small and overlooked, was left unsecured in the confusion. Ottoman soldiers poured through. The breach inside the city spread faster than any defense could contain. Once the enemy was inside the walls, Constantinople was lost. Emperor Constantine was last seen fighting near the gate of St. Romanus. Accounts differ. Some say he was killed in combat. Others say his body was never identified. What matters is this: he did not escape. He did not surrender. He disappeared with his empire. By mid-morning, Ottoman banners flew over the walls. The city that had resisted the world for more than 1,000 years was no longer Byzantine. The gates that had once protected civilization were now open. Inside the city, order collapsed. Soldiers scattered. Civilians fled or hid. Churches were entered. Homes were broken into. The old world gave way to a new one, violently and irreversibly. The Hagia Sophia, once the heart of Christian Constantinople, was filled with people seeking refuge. Within hours, it would become something else, a symbol not just of conquest, but of transition. The Byzantine Empire was finished, not gradually, not symbolically, but completely. This was not just the fall of a city. It was the end of a line stretching back to Rome, an empire that had preserved law, culture, and memory through the darkest centuries of Europe, vanished in a single morning. What fell with Constantinople was more than stone and banners. It was continuity. The idea that the Roman world still lived in the East ended that day. The world crossed a threshold. Medieval Europe began to fade. The modern age moved closer. The Ottomans did not just conquer a city. They inherited a position, a crossroads between continents, a capital of trade, faith, and power. The center shifted, and Byzantium became history. The final night mattered because it showed how empires truly end. Not when the first blow is struck, but when the last option disappears. When survival is no longer possible, only legacy remains. Byzantium chose legacy. It did not open its gates to survive. It closed them to be remembered. That night, before the assault, the empire still existed. Its laws, its rituals, its emperor, its faith. By the next day, all of it belonged to the past. The fall of Constantinople was not sudden. It was the final moment of a long decline. But that does not make it less decisive. History often gives empires many chances. Byzantium used all of them. When the gates closed for the last time, the empire did not expect mercy. It expected an ending worthy of its name. and it received one. The Byzantine Empire did not fade away. It stood until the walls broke, and when they did, the world changed. That is why this night matters, because sometimes history ends not with surrender, but with silence after the gates are breached, and once they are, nothing remains the same.